join me in welcoming Manu Bhaskaran, Director, Centennial Group International, Founding Director and CEO, Centennial Asia Advisors, Curtis Chin, Asia Fellow, Milken Institute, former U.S. Ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. We have Charon, Executive Director in the Managing Director's Office, Khazanah Nasional, also Managing Director of Khazanah Research Institute, and Atsi Sheth, Senior Vice President, Moody's Investor Service. Now, Atsi, gentlemen, when you talk about these expectations, it is the investors who are expecting a lot from the leaders. Is that misplaced? I see you nodding, Atsi.
I'm nodding because in some sense, all optimism is misplaced. Things will never be as good as we think they will be in some sense. On the other hand, I think that change itself produces momentum, that when a new leadership gets elected, it's not only the leaders themselves, but it's the investors who behave in certain ways that creates conditions for change. So I would say some of that optimism, even if the leaders don't respond with exactly the policies the investors want them to, it's the investors themselves that are going to put in the money that will lead to growth, that will make this sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
But that will be disappointment. Obama came and everybody was expecting everything. And now, very divided.
Well, when expectations are too high, they will always be disappointed. So I'm sure Mr. Joko Widodo will disappoint in some way. But the real question is whether he can do enough good. And I suspect, if you look at his track record, he will make a big difference in two areas which really matter for Indonesia: bottlenecks in infrastructure and corruption. And if he can do that, and he disappoints in other areas, I think Indonesia is on to a good.
But what makes you so optimistic? He has a very divided parliament. He's yet to choose his cabinet, and people are just saying, who's pulling the strings?
But he had a divided assembly in Jakarta, and he had the political skill to push.
But Jakarta is the capital, it's much smaller, whether that can be translated on a wider scale.
It's a challenge. But he has shown that he is able to rise to the challenges.
Sharon?
Well, you look at Asia and you have this big overarching narrative, which is the triumph of democracy. In India's, 1.2 billion people, change of government, completely peaceful, no protests in the streets. Indonesia, the second largest or third largest country in Asia, huge change of government. And you have to remember, President Joko Widodo won against someone who came from the military. And in the old days, you would have expected riots on the streets and people not accepting the elections. Again, completely peaceful elections and a transfer of power. So at one level, you can say it's a triumph of democracy in Asia. And those of us who come from countries where it's been the same party in power in the independence, or in some cases, the same person in power since independence, or in some cases, the son of the same person in power since independence, it's remarkable. This change has happened in Asia. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to say that in Indonesia, you've had a man of the people elected. Mr. Joko Widodo is a man from outside the system, and again, an amazing triumph. And he was running against someone who was very establishment, as I said earlier, a hard man, a military man, a man whom most people would have assumed would have run Indonesia, and yet Mr. Joko won. So that's a great triumph for populism, a great triumph for the people. Contrast that to Mr. Moody. I mean, I was at a talk yesterday about India, and he was described as the first rightist government in India. I'll go further than that. His human rights record and Mr. Prabowo's human rights records are probably not that far different. And when I'm talking about human rights here, I'm talking about the most basic right, the right to life. So you can see that on the one hand, you've got actually a move back to a very kind of strong leader. Now, Asia loves strong leaders, right? We love Lee Kuan Yew. We love, well, many people love Tun Mahathir. Many people, Deng Xiaoping. We love strong leaders, and we like this idea that a strong leader will come. But the great thing about what's happening in Indonesia is that it's not a vote for the strong leader. It is a vote for the man of the people, and this is a big change we have to come across in Asia. But there's another. Stop there.
But it comes with its own problems. I mean, at a time when we talk about a more streamlined economy, a borderless world, and here we have Indonesia, man of the people, but also someone who's looking more nationalist in his policies.
Well, earlier you were saying, get ready for disappointment. Yeah. I don't know if I would go so far, but I just can't think of anywhere in the world where you aren't disappointed in your leader, right? Because expectations are so high. But I think, I'm generally a glass half full person. We were talking about yesterday as we look at Asia. First, I think we need to understand Asia is more than even the places where we have new leaders. Then when we think about investors in this region, it's not just about China. It's not just about India. And even when we think about Southeast Asia, I've got Laos on one hand. The hot place is Myanmar these days, but a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money in Myanmar. But there will also be money made. And so I think it's not just about changes in leadership. Are there really going to be changes in policy? And that's unclear. Even with Xi Jinping in China, I just read a piece in a blog on U.S.-China, the differences between these two places, and it was really about corruption. Xi Jinping has embarked on this anti-corruption campaign, but is it any different than ones that have preceded him every 10 years when leadership changes? At least in the U.S., everywhere there's corruption. But in the U.S., there's a rule of law. It's ruled by law, not by a couple people. And until Asia embraces that concept, I think even with new leaders, it won't matter. Because unless the systems are new, it's the same old, potion, just in a different bottle, I think is what we have so far.
And
Actually, I would if I could just disagree with that, I think it's a question of institutions being built. And you're right. I mean, we don't have the strength of institutions. And in some countries, the institutions that were strong have decayed. You know which one I'm referring to. But in Indonesia, institutions are being built. And I think this goes beyond just Mr. Joko Widodo. I think there are few sort of underlying forces at work that are pushing for institutions to be built. In China, the entire elite leadership of the party realizes that corruption and cronyism is really eroding their claim to power. And they have to rebuild the institution. I think it goes beyond just Xi Jinping.
I'm unconvinced. Unless we see someone that is, I don't say taken down, but ideally investigated in a system that includes an independent judiciary and a free media. Yeah. It'll be the same. We're taking down people who are corrupt, which is a good thing. But I'm taking down people who are opposed to me.
That's like saying that only the American system works.
Far from
the American Western system, it is true, and we admire it. But there are other approaches that can work, maybe not so well, but can actually keep, as long as every 5 years you take a photograph, has there been an improvement? And I think that's what you see in Asia. We cannot build the Western system overnight. It's going to take a generation.
Atsi?
Just to follow up on your point about institutions, India is a country with an independent judiciary. The judiciary does what the legislature doesn't want it to do sometimes, what the executive doesn't want it to do sometimes, with respect to coal most recently. There's also a media that is really independent, as we all know. You hear all kinds of things in the Indian media that you don't elsewhere, and yet corruption is rampant. So I don't know that you can have those two things without corruption necessarily growing. That's one thing, but I also think institutions are a product of history, and they're a product of wealth as well. And you've got to look at income levels when you think of institutions. That democracy is a nice to have when you've got clothes and when you've got sanitation and when you've got food. And until you've got all those things, I think democracy will take longer to build in the manner it has been in the U.S. or across the Atlantic as well.
Is Moody on the right track?
I think following up on your point is that Modi was elected not because of his views on religion or because of his view of his record in Gujarat, but he was elected to provide infrastructure. He was elected to provide economic growth, which is a very reasonable thing to be elected for, which is what all governments in Asia, whether they're right or left, are elected to provide. And I think that is something that he knows, his party knows. His party was voted out of power 10 years ago because while they brought growth, they didn't distribute it equally. So I think the lessons that have been learned from that is that you need not just growth, but you need to provide for all 1.2 billion, not the 200 million that the market recognizes. And in that sense, I think the recognition is there. Implementing anything in a country of 1 billion people is just hard. So I don't know if he'll continue to implement everything he's been elected.
And also for Modi, the question really is whether he can get the support of the states.
Absolutely.
The states decide on 3/4 of the projects to be implemented. And until that happens, it's a big question mark.
It is, but he's been a state chief minister, so he knows what the wants are, the gives are. And I always say, if you're a politician, you've got to know how to negotiate. That's your job. That's what you go to work to do every day is negotiate. And
Our past leaders have failed. What makes you think Modi will succeed?
I'm not sure that he will, but I do think that is exactly what his job description is to negotiate this thing.
I think we're all hopeful all of these new leaders will succeed, but can they afford what they're promising? Even Modi in his campaign talked so much about critical infrastructure needs in India, which is so true. If you travel in India, you travel in so many parts of Asia, we need better infrastructure. But the reality is that we're going to finance infrastructure not by more borrowing from the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, these governments need to put in place a system that will allow capital markets to flourish, that allow businesses that want to invest their money there and not bring it here to Singapore. As much as we love Singapore, we need to think through how can the whole region grow versus parts of the region are shifting all their money to elsewhere because their own systems are not changing, even though the leadership has changed.
You know, it's just strange sitting in Singapore talking about Asia. You know, Singapore's got a GDP per capita which is higher than the United States. I mean, this is a first world country. And we're talking about Asia as if it were one country, where it's not. I mean, look at India. Uttar Pradesh, the biggest state in India, it's got 200 over million people. It's almost the size of Indonesia. So when we're talking about complexities in Asia, we really got to look at things in a completely different way. Singapore's population is 5 million, about the size of Scotland. And you know, the way Scotland has taken up the whole of international press, I mean, it's 5 million people. I mean, 5 million people is a third-tier city and town in China, which no one's ever heard of. So yet we get so worked up about the wrong thing. So you can't talk of one Asia. I mean, you know, you've all met this European who probably speaks 7 languages. And 7 European languages, which you can, because if you learn French, you can learn Italian, you can learn Spanish, it's all very similar. You learn Hindi, it gets you no closer to knowing Mandarin. You learn Malay, it gets no closer to you learning Thai. I mean, there is no one Asia. It's a convenient geographical label, but there is no one Asia. So this talk of a change in Asia, I think I mean, it makes a great narrative, and it makes a great kind of investment thesis, but it's got no relation to reality. The reality is Mr. Joko Widodo having to govern, you know, an island of, you know, a country of thousands of islands and 200 over million people. Mr. Moody having to govern a country of 1.3 billion people, some of whom are the brightest people on the planet, and some of whom live in, you know, real poverty. And that's a challenge which is unique to India. I mean, you can't extrapolate from Malaysia to India. And you know, much as I like to talk and generalize about Asia, I do think that we are really overgeneralizing.
But in the end, does it even matter who's in power? Because as far as investors are concerned, all you need is a stable country, stable policy.
No, Haslinda, I think the leader matters. The direction he gives, the quality and tenure of leadership, the culture he builds around his skills in building alliances. I mean, India is you know, as you said, you have to negotiate. It's a matter of building alliances and coalitions to push things through. And the skill of a leader is vital to this. And it's the same in Indonesia. So the leader really does matter.
Yeah, jumping elsewhere in the region. Think about the Philippines. We've had a new leader, for 4 years? Aquino is, 2/3 of the way through his term. Great hope, and actually the Philippines is doing relatively well. Their challenge is the population is also doing very well also. And so can they ever catch up with the population growth, their economic growth? So leadership has mattered, but the reality is that the present president built on some of the things that the last president did, to her great credit. And so as we think about the personalities, we love them or we hate them, but we gotta look at the real results, and that we gotta drive down into the different sectors. And some sectors in the Philippines are thriving. Others, it's a much more difficult time because the government is not getting out of the way. The government is welcoming or continuing a system of really what is an oligopoly. Great people, probably all of my friends, owning everything. But we got to break that up a little bit to allow new entrepreneurs, outside investors, and others to come in. And that's really the story across Asia. And I think those places that do it best, like a Singapore, which is very open, will succeed faster than others. But I think you're absolutely right. I remember I was with this firm called Burson Marshall. I used to run their Beijing operations. And people would say, oh, Singapore, that's the size of your district, right? Chaoyang district, that's like 4 million people, right? And so, you know, of course, there's a big difference between head of a great place like Singapore and being like the mayor of a sub-district. But the numbers are so vast and different. So I think smart investors really need to drive down into what is that actual opportunity, not just in the country, but in that state or in that business that they're going to partner with.
The changes in leadership are happening against a backdrop of a more aggressive, a more assertive China. Can these leaders that have been put in place, well, for lack of a better word, face this new China?
Well, you know, the Indian and Chinese leaders are meeting as we speak.
Today.
And I think that China recognizes that to be a power means to negotiate with other powers that are far far less powerful, both in terms of economics and politics. But, again, China is a behemoth. It is far, you talked about there not being one Asia. This is an example. I mean, it just exceeds everyone else in size, in political power, in the way it's recognized in the rest of the world, that it will always be different, and it will always, I think, be more powerful than the rest of these countries.
Is China getting more aggressive?
Isn't it in the South
Well, I mean-
China Sea?
From the Chinese point of view, they're not.
They're being,
Certainly
I
that's
think
what they
they're
say.
being more assertive. Like, we had Ambassador Tommy Ko today say to an audience member who asked about China's aggressiveness.
Yeah.
And he said, let me rephrase your question in a,
Friendly way.
a more friendly way. But it is actually the same point. It's all about vocabulary. Are they more assertive or more aggressive? But I think the world needs to get used to China being back on the world stage. I think it's a good thing. But at the same time, China needs to also recognize they are not first among the equals of Asia. I feel we don't talk enough about Japan, still the third largest economy in the world. And I guess we're all still hopeful for Abe, whether this third era of reforms is really going to work. But clearly, Japan and India are not going to accept China being the most eminent place in this region. They got to all work with each other and figure out how they're going to live together. Or as one of the speakers this morning said, we'll face the reality that economic integration does not prevent war, right? You will act in your own national interest, or what you envision are your national interests, even if it means taking something from someone who will then try and fight back and get it back.
I think whether China is assertive or aggressive, the fact of the matter is it is perceived by enough powers in Asia to be assertive that there is a pushback. And that pushback makes geopolitics in Asia much more risky. You have Japan pushing back, you've got Vietnam pushing back, you've got the Philippines pushing back. And even countries like Malaysia are quietly pushing back by allowing US aircraft to be based in Sabah, but they do it more quietly. So there is a great concern, and I'm not sure whether China has actually managed this very well. They will learn, I think, and they will change their strategy. But China has legitimate interests in both the China Sea as well as the Indian Ocean. How it tries to protect those interests will determine how things go. If they try to protect their interests by making absurd territorial claims, then there'll be a big pushback. If they learn to negotiate and work a win-win way, as the previous panel said, then I think we are fine. A lot depends on the leaders and also whether we can build institutional frameworks like they eventually built in Europe to deal with the Cold War that allow these risks to be mitigated and contained. Right now, we don't have such a framework, so an accidental clash could well spiral out of control.
Well, it does seem like the leaders are adopting a different strategy as well. If you take a look at Modi, he's been courting Abe, right? That's making China really uncomfortable.
And it's a wise political strategy. I mean, he has a lot of affinity for Abe's policies. He has a need for financing. I mean, India's infrastructure financing needs are not going to be financed by its government, which already has a debt of 70% of GDP. So he needs the money. That's one thing. And Japan has an interest. Japanese companies have an interest. So this is really mutual interests coming together that work very well. But that backdrop made the current meeting, I think, a lot more smoother because now India has a little more negotiating power than it did before with the Japanese sort of backing, at least the economic backing. So I think that was visionary, the Japan trip and the announcements that came out of that trip, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, India needs infrastructure. Depending on who you listen to, it runs in the trillions of dollars. So there's a huge need for infrastructure. And you're right. I mean, it's either China or Japan who's got both the money and the long-term vision to fund that kind of infrastructure. I mean, the president of China visited India, seems on his birthday, I believe, on Prime Minister's birthday, which is, I mean, if you're talking about building bridges, that's the best way of doing it. And I can see it all happening. I mean. Within Asia, we've come to the situation where there's enough savings in Asia to fund Asian infrastructure. I mean, one of the things which a lot of Asian governments used to complain about is that we export to the West and we get money from the West and we don't know what to do with that money, so we send the money back to the West and buy government bonds or T-bonds and all
very
that.
low rates.
And then that money is managed by an American fund manager who then reinvests it back in the country where the money came from in the first place. So that's always been something which people were moaning about before. But I think now you've got a possibility for that happening. You've got the BRICS Bank, for example, where okay, it's not quite Asia, but the idea is that Asian savings can be mobilized for Asia. And there are lots of really productive places to mobilize those savings. I mean, infrastructure in India is fantastic.
You know, what's funny?
Infrastructure in Indonesia, same thing.
You know, what's funny is in the US, they talk a lot about this so-called pivot to Asia. You know, is it a bunch of rhetoric or is it real? But when you read all the headlines of changing Asia, Asian countries are pivoting to each other. So the headline that I saw was like, India, you know, pivots to Japan. You know, is Thailand pivoting to Burma? You know, is China pivoting, I don't know, to Cambodia? But I think with all these pivots, I think we have to look at the real numbers as to where is that investment going. You know, I know from a US viewpoint, there's actually more investment in Southeast Asia than there is US investment in China. But all the rhetoric is always about China. So that's where when I tell people, when you think about Asia, think about Southeast Asia in particular. And there's been talk this morning about something called the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, economic community, where these 10 nations are going to kind of come together. And I think there'll be terrific opportunities, not just for Southeast Asian countries there, but from outside countries, to use one country there as kind of a base to deal with others. You know, yesterday, I led a discussion with a senior government official from the wonderful little kingdom of Bhutan. You know, 700,000 people, and they're saying, you know, pivot to India through Bhutan, right? So everyone has their own twist on things. But I think they have a great point that think carefully about how you're going to make some money in this region, and it might come in ways that you don't think. Right?
Will the AEC change the investment landscape in Asia? A
I
single
think so.
market?
Yeah.
I think so. Again, it's almost like new leaders, new institutions, new organizations. We're going to be a little bit disappointed if we have these great high hopes. But even when you think about Europe, it came slowly, right? But I think it's a terrific step forward, you know, and hopefully the AEC will also mean there'll be less conflict, at least between those 10 nations of the AEC. Now it's all about conflict with China. But remember in the old days, you know, some of these Southeast Asians were fighting with each other. And so I think it's a great step forward, but I think we still got a long way to go.
Actually, I think the AEC is positive, but it's going to take a while too.
Absolutely.
Because I think the rhetoric has run ahead of reality. And if you speak to companies with operations across Southeast Asia, they will tell you that the practical difficulties have virtually not gone at all. It's still the same. So, but it will take time, and I think it will be good. But I think what we should also look at is the ground-up integration that's also happening. We have, for instance, between Malaysia and Singapore, this initiative called Iskandar, which is a fantastic initiative. Fantastic synergies will be released. So it's more smaller scale, but I think much more effective. And I think this is going to encourage others to do this kind of cross-border integration. Already, between the northeastern towns of Thailand and Laos, you're getting tremendous cross-border interaction, and again, very positive. The same thing is going to happen Thai-Myanmar border as well. And then you've got the Greater Mekong sub-region, fantastically successful, but sub-regional initiative, and that's also working out very well. So you have multiple modes of integration that are weaving the region together, very positively.
I get a sense that everything's going to happen slow, right? But do investors have the patience? I mean, take a look at India. We're talking about, what has Modi achieved in the first 100 days? Investors don't seem to have the patience to wait for these changes to happen.
You know, that 100 days reference, I have to address it because I feel like this is a media-created milestone.
So now we're
Yes. You know, the government's elected for 5 years. It's a billion-person country, $2 trillion economy. The investors are there because it's a billion-person country and a $2 trillion economy, and they know it'll take time. But the media has set this milestone that we must see results in 100 days, and when you don't, you're set up for disappointment. Having said that, I think investors in India specifically, it's the regulatory environment, which is just really onerous and very, very difficult to navigate. And there's no reason why that could not be dismantled over a shorter period. Will it be? I don't think so. I think there's too much bureaucratic inertia. So it's not just Modi or his willingness to do something. It's everybody else that is the same, that has been there, you know, for decades. So I do think that investors will be disappointed if they expected the regulatory environment to change overnight. But I think if you're a large enough economy, fortunately or unfortunately, you can count on them being there just because of size. It's the smaller economies that don't have that luxury, I think.
But I think to defend the media.
Thank you, Curtis.
Can we erase that? No. But to defend the media, I used to work with CEOs and heads of countries sometimes, and really your first 100 days sets the tones. I think you're absolutely right. It's unrealistic to expect a lot being done in your first 100 days. but you reinforce what are your priorities? What are you going to act on first? Is it infrastructure? Is it corruption? Is it a religious divide? I don't know. But that's where those first 100 days are so important. And so I think for Modi, I think there was a lot of criticism that, well, where are the details? Which is maybe a little bit unfair, but
why?
When
Where
can
is
we
the
get
framework?
the details? Why can't I have 120 days worth of details?
Well,
I
agree
would
with
say
you
that 100
there.
days is important. You know, I say to people sometimes, we'll talk on this stage and you won't remember anything we say. So go back to the videotape. But to help people remember things, I say when I look at an investment opportunity or I look at a country, people used to say to me when I stepped down from the Asian Development Bank Board of Directors, who will be the next BRIC? Who will be that Brazil, Russia, India, China, to capture investments and imaginations? And to be honest, they always want me to say whatever country I'm in. Can't you say Indonesia? But I said to them, I worry less about who will be that next country. I worry about what I've called now the little BRIC, which is not a country, but it's bureaucracy, regulation, interventionism by government, and corruption. And to your point, there is no one right way in all of these areas, although we'd argue we don't need ever corruption. But what is the balance? And so when I look at in India, what are the steps to address the bureaucracy? What are the steps to address regulations that have either run amok or just not enforced or enforced differently with foreign companies versus domestic companies? Is interventions by government getting out of control? Maybe you got to do it in an emergency, but it shouldn't be the go-to way to do policy. Let's intervene. And clearly corruption matters so much in this region. And corruption is linked to governance and accountability. So I say to people, as you assess all these new leaders, what are their priorities in their first 100 days or in their first year, or now President Xi Jinping in the first 2 years, and what is he doing in these 4 areas? And it's very mixed. And I think investors know that, and so the money shifts. And to defend investors, I defended media, now I'm going to defend investors, all these people that people don't defend. Investors also, you can't lump all together. I have investor friends, they make money when things, don't do so well in a country. I have short-term investor friends, I have long-term investor friends, right? And so I think the importance for all of these people is to really understand these individual Asian countries. And the reality sometimes, even if the leader is my best buddy, that isn't enough to understand how you're going to make money or lose money in a given opportunity.
You talked about setting the tone for Jokowi. When he comes to power, what would you like to see? I know it's unfair to put the 100 days, but what are the things that you'd like to see that would tell the investors that he is on the right track?
The appointments to the cabinet. If he appoints credible, strong people as Minister of Finance, Coordinating Minister for the Economy, Ministers for Trade Industry, then I think...
By that you mean technocrats?
Men and women of ability and competence. It doesn't have to be a technocrat. It could be a political person, but if he has credibility and he follows the right policies, I think that's what... May 2013, the Indonesian rupiah fell by 20-something%. President Yudhoyono then appointed Khatib Basri as finance minister, and you had a tremendous regaining of confidence because the right man in the right place, pushing the right policies, gives credibility and confidence.
Charon?
No, I agree.
You're still with us, no?
I am. I am. I'm just listening with awe to all the learned talk. No, for Indonesia, every leader in Asia has got the same platform. I'll get better.
Corruption.
I'll fight corruption. I'll get better infrastructure. I'll sort out the bureaucracy. I'll bring in foreign investment, and that's everyone's platform, which is sad because if they're wrong, they're all wrong. We're all wrong at the same time. But all leaders say that, and so obviously that's what you want from President Jokowi. Now, another narrative for Jokowi is to compare him to Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi because behind Mr. Jokowi stands the party, and behind the party stands Ibu Megawati. Now, I don't think that's a good comparison at all, but you can always throw these comparisons about. But certainly, that's one of the things you want him to do. And he was mayor of Jakarta, and he fixed Jakarta. But fixing a city of 10 million people and fixing a country of 200 plus million people is hard. I mean, yesterday there was an India panel, and the businessmen they were very, 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 very pro Mr. Moody. And one example given was someone called up Mr. Moody, wrote to Mr. Moody and said, "I've got this investment," and Mr. Moody's office wrote back to him in 3 days. And that was seen as an example of how proactive and pro-business Mr. Modi is. But you can't run a country of 1.3 billion people by the Prime Minister answering emails. You run a country that size by having a solid institution behind you. And Mr. Joko Widodo has got to do that. But no, they are very, Singapore's a large country. There are many, many talented people there. And I'm sure he'll get good people on his cabinet. But can I just talk a little bit about time horizons? Okay, so investor time horizon, we talked about short-term, long-term investors. I always like to take the long view. The last 500 years, for example, has been an aberration in kind of history. I mean, in the past, the center of economy for the world was China and India. And I think we're just seeing the world going back to how it was for the 500 years before. So if you look at a map of 15th century Asia, it looks very much like Asia of today. A strong India, a strong China, the Southeast Asian empires of Malacca, of Majapahit, of Ayutthaya. The world is becoming more and more like how it used to work, how it used to look in the 1500s. So I think, or the 1400s. So if you're going to take the long view, you should always invest in Asia because everything reverts to the mean. And if that is the mean, if there's going to be a massive mean reversion. That's a big mega macro trade, mean reversion. So that's
Okay.
If
you take a look at the region, this goes to everybody. What's the biggest risk you see for investors? That is your stuff.
Right now, if I think about Southeast Asia, I do worry about the return of sectarianism. It's the biggest risk. It's funny, when the big BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, added South Africa, I felt when I talked, now I had to have a little S to add to my bureaucracy, regulation, innovation, and corruption. But doing so much work in, Thailand, Myanmar, but clearly Indonesia. I used to go in and out of Afghanistan. As countries have become freer, all the things that strong leaders held way down are popping up. So whether it's, in the unfortunate situation in Myanmar right now with the Buddhist-Muslim unrest, but even if you look at Modi's campaign, rightly or wrongly, people felt there were some anti-Muslim elements to it. So I think one test for him, and I think the Muslim population is something like 15% of India's population, a vibrant part of the Indian community. But when you look at all the economic and social indicators, they're so much worse off. And so unless countries here address these growing divides, and sometimes it's an income divide, but often when you look at some of the income divides in Asia, they're related to religious divides, ethnic divides and all. And I'm fearful that some of these things will be that black swan that no model plans for, but all of a sudden, just like an unknown tsunami wiping in, all of a sudden things will come up. And China, we really don't know because unlike here, the media is much more, having to say or not say certain things. And there, we really don't know about the unrest that is going on in China. We're all hopeful that the leadership there will succeed in uniting the country, but in doing so, let's hope they don't do it by encouraging sectarianism or unwittingly encouraging China versus Japan, Japan versus Korea. But I'm fearful we're seeing more and more of that. And people, laugh sometimes, particularly if they don't know the U.S. But in the U.S., we're all about TV, and the Game of Thrones is this hit TV series. And I say to people, sometimes I feel like I'm in an Asian Game of Thrones. Ancient history and kingdoms duking it out for preeminence because, 1 millennia ago, we ran this world, right? And are we seeing a return to that versus what I think should be a movement forward and countries working together and companies cooperating across borders?
Manu?
I'm also concerned about politics, more politics within countries. I think what worries me is the ease with which vested interests can capture legislative power and regulatory power. And speaking to investors' concerns, if you want to make money in a country, the fundamentals of the country may be fantastic, but if the business environment is twisted and skewed to favor certain groups over others, then investors may not make much money, and you do not get the healthy bits of capitalism, which is that you have this kind of creative destruction, and the bad guys get sieved out and the good guys rise. And I'm worried that you're seeing signs of stronger and stronger vested interests, even in Singapore, even in Indonesia, and we need to tackle this.
Charon?
Yes. ethnic divides and also, income inequality, which is, a big subject all over the world, but it's a big subject here. I mean, again, Singapore is an outlier. In today's Straits Times, I don't know if you've got it in your hotel room, but the front page was a new household income survey report. So the poorest 20% of Singaporean makes 2,000 Singapore dollars a month, which to the rest of Asia is a fortune. And the top 20% average monthly household income is $24,000. So even within Singapore, it's a 10 times divide. And then the average household expenditure for the average Singaporean family is 4,000 Singapore dollars, which again is a fortune for the rest of Asia. But that's just Singapore, and you can see that huge divide. So the people in the bottom 20%, have incomes, have far less than what the average, supposedly average household in Singapore spends. And out of that $2,000, half of that comes from government transfers. So this is another thing we don't realize, is actually Singapore has a very advanced welfare state, and it looks after the bottom 20%. Now, in most other countries in Asia, there is no way they can afford that kind of welfare state, but you're going to have more and more poverty. And we talk about this demographic dividend, which you have in India, the demographic dividend in Indonesia, but that demographic dividend relies on there being jobs for all these people to work at. And again, if we can't give them proper jobs, high-income jobs, you're going to have this worsening income inequality. And it's getting seems the wrong word, but it's getting really marked. I mean, you can walk, you can see Lamborghinis and Ferraris in places which don't have any roads. And people, on the one hand, people talking about knowing London better than they know their own city. So yeah, this is one of the underlying tensions, but it's not an Asian phenomenon. It does seem to be a global phenomenon. And yesterday, the deputy minister was talking very passionately, I thought, about the change in the Singaporean dream, where once upon a time you could come from a poor family and move up, and now if the grandchildren of that poor family now are now kind of like control the world, and they spend more money on the children, they spend more time on the children, and the odds just get are against the person who's poor, and that is one of those if we're talking one of the time bombs in Asia, well actually probably a global time bomb, is worsening income inequality.
I'd say all of the above. And what's interesting to me about the theme here is that these are long, simmering sort of trends that suddenly erupt, and then we go, oh, how did terrorism come about? How did we have a revolution? And I think that that's the event risk that comes from these very long-term simmering trends. And on the flip side of that, I think is another long trend that Asia's always benefited from, and that's growth in the Western Hemisphere. That the biggest economies in Asia, that's Japan and China, have really benefited from external demand. And if they are to be generators of an Asian sort of manufacturing revival or growth revival, they will have to replace the fact that the rest of the world, that's the Western world, is not going to grow as fast in the next 3 decades because of demographics, because they've reached a certain level of maturity. So I think sort of finding Asian growth engines for countries that are now going from $1,000 per capita income to $6,000, which is not a lot, that's going to be a challenge, again, a long simmering challenge. And in the near term, I think Asia is exposed to energy prices and financial risks a lot more than countries that developed 3 decades ago were. They just weren't exposed to the same sort of volatility, and I think that's a risk for investors.
I was just going to add, we've talked really at this macro level about all these Asian countries, but I'd encourage people also to look at the micro level. And what I mean there is not just Asia, under new management, but our Asian companies under new management. So as we think about governance of companies, what are we investing in? We're actually investing usually in companies, right? And in some places, I feel they've gone a little bit backwards, where state-owned enterprises are really on the rise again because of government support. Versus what I believe, which is the private sector will lead the way with real sustainable job creation. So as I look at a company or look at a sector, to what degree is a country allowing innovation in their economies through their own homegrown businesses? And when they move around from, my homegrown businesses succeed because I subsidize them to death and stop all my competitors. And until we have Asian companies and Asian company governance in a way under new management or new structures, I think Asia will be constrained in how quick and how innovative and how great it can be. But I have faith in Asia. I mean, Asia will slowly grow. Asia in some places will quickly grow. But again, it all for me comes back to governance and how do these companies really succeed in attracting investors is through being more transparent about their books. It'll be fascinating how Alibaba plays out. This great big deal happening in the US. They're kind of less transparent than other places. Hong Kong wouldn't even allow them to list because the rules are a little bit differently in New York than in Hong Kong. But we're buying into this great opportunity that is China, that is the internet. But then when you look at, well, how am I going to make money off of that? Do I just assume I'm going to make money because people will follow me and buy it also, and then I'll sell it? But then we need to look at the underlying, the valuation and what's going to come out of that company. I think we got to look at all these companies in Asia when we think about investing in them.
And that takes me to my next question. We're talking about risks. Where do you see the most potential? Atsi, maybe we'll start with you this time.
I think, again, corporations, because, again, I think I'm a macroeconomist, so we look for macro trends, and we look for textbook things to happen. But the example I like to give is of India and its savings rate. The reason India grows so fast is it has a very high savings rate. In the late 60s, the government nationalized banks. Economists like me, trained in Chicago, would have said, oh, horrible, horrible thing to do. This is going to be the end of this economy. After they nationalized them, they sent them out into the rural areas, and the banks had to set up branches and collect deposits. India's savings rate was, in the low double digits, then 10 or so percent. It's now about 30%, and largely because households, money came out of mattresses and was put into the banks, and that has financed a good part of the growth that India's seen. And my point here is simply this, that my real answer is I don't know, but that if I look for textbook examples of policy or textbook examples even of governance, I'm not going to find the answer, that it's probably going to be enterprises that innovate in ways that we don't know. And Asia certainly has those. So I think that's the potential.
Is there a market that you prefer when you take a look at Asia?
I think all the big Asian economies offer size, and that sort of is, size ameliorates the risks that are there, but of course, high growth. I mean, you've been talking about countries like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. Those are probably going to see a lot of growth as well. So I think that, it depends on whether you want high risk and high growth or lower risk, but also fairly high growth compared to the rest of the world.
Sharon?
In terms of risk or in terms of growth?
Potential.
Or potential, both.
Opportunities.
Okay, well, sorry. Well, I mean, in terms of risk, the world's so connected now. What the U.S. Fed decides really affects Asia immediately. We saw the taper tantrum the last time, and that was the risk no one foresaw. Right. When the taper tantrum came, at one point we were worried will we have a repeat of 97, 98, and capital flight coming out. So I'd say the biggest short-term risk is what the Fed would do, and after that, what the European Central Bank will do.
In terms of opportunities.
In terms of opportunities, I'd say come to Malaysia. Malaysia is...
Okay, now that the message is given.
Okay. No, okay. I'll tell you a little bit about, the way, definitely Asia. I mean, we in Malaysia, we're firm believers in ASEAN. We're firm believers in the growth potential of ASEAN. We're firm believers that the AEC, while it won't turn into a common market tomorrow, will in the long term provide for more trade and investment. I mean, there's a lot of history of trade and investment between Southeast Asian countries, and we believe Southeast Asia is a place to be. I mean, if you're looking at India, you're looking at China, there is another country called ASEAN with 600 million people, with a GDP bigger than India, and with countries like Mr. Tony Fernandez, whom you saw this morning. I mean, that is a quintessential Southeast Asian story, and it could have only happened in Southeast Asia. And now, dare I say, AirAsia could have only have been started by Malaysian, because Malaysia is this amazing multicultural country, and we all have to learn to get along with people of different colors, different religions, and different everything else, and we do. And so Malaysia is a great place for that. So AirAsia, if you want, is a proof of the success of Southeast Asia. I used to work in a bank, which is also a Southeast Asian bank. Many Malaysian banks, in fact, are Southeast Asian banks. So I would say invest in Southeast Asia. Don't just look at Singapore. Singapore is a very expensive country to do business in. Kuala Lumpur is very nice. It's not far away. It's got nice food, nice people. And so I would suggest headquarters yourself in Kuala Lumpur and use that to invest in Southeast Asia. That would be my investment thesis.
He came with that message, I'm sure. Manu?
Yeah, I think I would make a strong pitch for Southeast Asia. I think we're on the cusp of a real acceleration in economic growth. And the question then is, does that translate into returns for investors? Well, look at the hard data. Look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis in the US Department of Commerce. They have data for all of the world. and you can work out a return on capital employed. And Southeast Asia consistently for the last 25 years, for which we have data, outperforms any other region in the world. Malaysia and Indonesia in particular outperform very, very strongly. So this is a high return region that is going to accelerate for a variety of reasons. And I think it'll take a huge political catastrophe to shake us off track. The point about entrepreneurship, I have to admit, as a Singaporean, I'm very jealous of Malaysia. You have not just Tony Fernandez, you have the CIMB, people there. You have this fantastic oil services company called Dialog, which is nothing 15 years ago. It's a massive giant economy. I mean, they have this capacity to overcome the problems in the environment, business environment, and really move ahead. And I think you'll see the same thing happen over time in Indonesia and also in Thailand. Don't forget Thailand. Headlines are all bad, but the underlying economy is fantastic. You cannot find a more flexible, diversified, adaptive economy than Thailand anywhere in the world.
Is there any reason to think that Southeast Asia, since both of you are pitching for the region, is there any reason to think that perhaps Southeast Asia is getting complacent?
No, we have fantastic competition. Look at Mexico. Peña Nieto in Mexico is liberalizing the economy. You're getting nearshoring, a lot of activity moving out of Asia into Mexico. And you've got Poland emerging. We've got competition all over. And that's forcing us to keep on our toes.
One of the things the Milken Institute does is convene these innovation labs, financial workshops with different governments around the world. And we did our first here in Asia with the government of Bangladesh. Very textile-dependent economy, but exploring ways to grow. And so when we talk about Asia, and I'm with you all on Southeast Asia, Malaysia too, and Singapore, but I say don't forget these other markets, and particularly those out watching us on YouTube or in this room, that there's money to be made in places like Bangladesh, in Pakistan, dare I say even in Afghanistan, but understand the risk. But there is great opportunity. And I think one shout out of my own, one of the things I've done since stepping down from the Asian Development Bank board is I joined the advisory board of a company called Equator Pure Nature. And really, it's a company focused on Southeast Asia. And it's taking advantage of some of the trends that we see in Asia. And in this case, allergy rates, health issues are really getting worse and worse in Asia because of pollution. So this is an innovative company with an American CEO, but a Thai company that is going to launch, all organic, or I should say really hypoallergenic certified and natural line of cleaning products, already accepted very much in Europe and in the US. But these trends are also coming to Asia, and smart companies, smart people are going to make money, whether it's like this American and his brand, Pipper Standard, or it's a Tony Fernandez. Terrific story, and it's so great that it comes from Malaysia. And so when I say to governments ask me, how do I get foreign direct investment into my country? How do you help us? Help us think that through. I would say, well, one, there's some basic things you need to do in terms of your regulations and things, but give me some case studies and examples that show that people are already doing it. And that's where AirAsia is great. So all of these countries, I say to them, give me an example of where people are already succeeding and doing things. And if you can't find many examples, doesn't that tell you something, right? And so for me, it's not about the risk. There's always risk. Understand them. It's about the opportunity. In Southeast Asia in particular, with the ASEAN Economic Community happening, there's going to be great opportunity here.
I'm tempted to ask just one final question, but we have just a minute to go. Very quickly, we talked about the opportunities in India, in Southeast Asia. There seems to be some kind of consensus. China. What do we do with China now? If you're sitting there trying to decide where to put your money, is it time to perhaps just channel it elsewhere apart from China?
Well, since we already had a pro-Malaysia shout-out, I'm going to say don't forget the main Asia-Pacific nation, which is the United States. And so, yes, we're diversifying everywhere. We're investing in Malaysia. We're buying things, all around the world. But I have ultimate confidence in the ability of the United States, regardless of who the leader is, to reinvent itself and provide investment opportunities for even Asian investors, let alone US investors. But yes, don't count China out. In the long run, it's going to get better and better and better. But I think there'll be bumps on that road in the near term for China as we look forward.
Manu, just
I agree. I think the bumps in the near term are the problem. Long term, China is going to be fantastic. But in the near term, you have to be very careful. I think markets are really complacent about China.
Charon, just final words.
Yeah, we're all holding our breath about China because, Southeast Asia, probably #1 trading partner is China. We depend on China. China is doing this incredible rebalancing act. We hope it doesn't fall off the tightrope because if it does, it might take the rest of us with them. But, the new leadership there seems to show great drive and determination. So we're hoping for the best for China, yeah.
I would agree completely with that. And to bring it back to the theme of this panel, I think what the leadership does in the next few years will actually determine the course that China takes.
Ladies and gentlemen, looks like time is up. We hope that it's been pretty useful to all of you. Please join me in thanking our panelists today. Curtis, Manu, Charon, Atsi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Brilliant.